Adam Gopnik has been writing for the New Yorker since 1986. He's a 3-time winner of the National Magazine Award for Essays and for Criticism, and in March 2013, Gopnik was awarded the Medal of Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters by the French Republic. He lives in New York with his wife and their 2 children. We are in Montreal at the Blue Met Literary Festival. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to start with bookstores, as you do in the book that we're going to be talking about, which is At the Stranger's Gate, a memoir / art criticism book.
/ essays / little microanthropologies about the fashionable world and the, what else is in there? The fashion magazines and restaurants and beyond.
Now, despite being requested or ordered, admonished not to go to a bookstore by your wife on your wedding day and during labor.
Absolutely.
So you're establishing your bona fides with me as a bibliophile.
I'm a totally obsessed reader, and this was not a joke. Martha, my wife, was genuinely concerned because she knows that if I pass by a bookstore, I'm drawn in like some cartoon character. The cartoon mouse smells the cheese, and you can see tangibly the cloud of aroma that draws the mouse on, and I'm like that around bookstores. I just have to go into a bookstore. The tragedy, of course, and tragedy is not too big a word within the context of it not being tragic, is that, of course, most bookstores in New York City, at least, have vanished now. Mm-hmm. So where there used to be 3 bookstores in a radius of 5 blocks of our apartment, there now is one. It's now one. Yeah. Weirdly, it's the same one that I actually went to when Martha was in labor. Okay. It's called the Corner Bookstore at 93rd and Madison. Right. And I went there. Martha had gone into labor early in the morning, and we didn't much like the obstetrician who was being obnoxious as obstetricians can be. I dare say, from his point of view, he was dealing with 2 hysterical people who had never had a baby before. One had never had a baby before, and the other had never watched a baby being had before. And therefore was more or less I kind of stormed out of the place and said, "Right, I'll just go, walk around the block." But walking around the block involved, or I chose to let it involve, going into a bookstore. And I remember the book that I found there was a beautiful copy of Santayana's, I think it was The Theory of Beauty.
But you made it back in time.
Just in time. But what I wasn't aware of, because time stops for me in bookstores. I mean, that both in the simple practical sense that I forget how long I've been there, and in the more metaphysical sense that that's what you go to a bookstore for, is to bathe in times past. And Martha was getting hysterical because she didn't know where I got to, and she kept hearing ambulances pulling into the hospital, of course, as they will, and she was sure that in my combination of abstraction and anger, I had been run over, and that the ultimate karmic irony had happened, that I had been run over on the very day of the birth of our son. But of course, nothing like that had happened. I got back there, and the panic had sufficiently dilated her that Luke, our son, was born about an hour later.
Very good. So happily ever after.
Happily to this point.
Yes. You don't really touch on bookstores much beyond that in this, as I said at the beginning, memoir. There's also short biographies in this book. Mm-hmm. And there's art criticism. So I'd like to break our conversation down into those 3 categories. There's also wise counsel, advice, and some really lovely phrases, sentences that you've structured that have stuck with me. So I want at the end to go with those. But let's start with art criticism. Your premise is that art traps time, that it registers fundamental vibration. I'd also argue that it predicts the future. So you look at the 1980s, where art becomes bullion. And I'm with Robert Hughes, who sees much of this art as opportunistic crap, despite accurately capturing the zeitgeist. You, I think, try to defend, in some cases at least, and praise this art. Is that true?
Yeah, what I was trying to represent there was a kind of argument that Bob Hughes, blessed memory, and I had we had it from when we met in 1984 until he died just a few years ago. When did Bob die now? I guess in about 2011, something like that. So yeah, we had an ongoing argument. I was very much, hugely impressed, how could one not be, by his argument at that time.
Yeah.
And I became something of a scold myself about the absurdities of the art market, which are indeed absurd, and to use your word, the opportunism of some artists, who were indeed opportunistic. But I guess in retrospect, I regret to some degree being a young scold about a lot of that art. Not that I would reject my own criticism of it, which was very vehement at the time, and I think remains sound in lots of ways. I don't care for narrowly politicized art because I think it's too easy to do. You can politicize the art world in an instant, but you haven't actually accomplished anything because politics aren't slogans, and sloganeering isn't argument. And at the same time, a lot of the stuff that became hugely popular then and is even more popular now, take an example more or less at random, Basquiat, Jean-Michel Basquiat's stuff, I was very hard on then, and I think I was right. It's sloppy, imperfect. If you want true primitivism, you look at other places. I remember saying at the time that it reminded me very much of the music of Michael Jackson, the painting of Basquiat, which is not to say that it was bad, it just was shallow, and I still feel that way. At the same time, I do recognize now that in retrospect, I'm giving you a very long answer to a short question, but
I'm going to ask a lot of short questions. So.
I'll try and make the answers shorter, but it's a complicated,
yes, absolutely it is.
Tale to tell. At the same time, I recognize now that when you look at that work, you see the time that it came from, and I don't just mean in a nostalgic way, in the way you see the 1960s if you look at old TV commercials. I mean that the contradictions of that time are very much in that art. Some of it in ways that are enormously potent, and I think will go on being potent in Eric Fischl's painting or David Sally's painting. In other people's stuff, in Cindy Sherman's movie stills, in other people's work, less so. But I think in general, it's a bad idea to bet against the art of your time. I think almost invariably what tends to happen is that the bad stuff gets winnowed out.
And what do you mean by bet, though? Like bet that it's going to stay around, or bet that it's going to be valuable, or what?
No, not bet that it's going to be valuable. That's a whole other set of questions. No, bet that it isn't significant in some way. And I say this with total guilt, because the truth is that I'm almost completely detached from the art world now. For years, I still did my Saturday tour in Chelsea and so on. Don't do it really anymore. My little brother, Blake, is a full-time art critic, and he's the real avant-garde deal. You can't wave a piece of video art in the depths of Brooklyn at him without him hopping on the subway and going to evaluate it. He does this wonderful thing called the Daily Pick, where he takes some image or work of art from someplace sometimes from the classics, but often from the avant-garde.
Where does he do that?
The Daily Pick now, I think it's on ArtNet, or it's one of those kind of umbrella sites. Anyway, I should add that he's a scholar, much more of a scholar than I am, and is writing a biography of Andy Warhol now. But anyway, I just mean that you can detach yourself from it because it no longer speaks to you. To take another instance, I am totally detached from hip-hop music. I love popular music. I write songs, musical theater. It's my great passion. Hip-hop, Kendrick Lamar, even at its highest, just doesn't speak to my condition. But I also recognize that it speaks to this condition. It speaks to the condition of its time. And I think you have to be, as you grow older, you have to start making those discriminations between things that simply don't speak to your preoccupations, condition, obsessions, taste, in the deepest possible sense, and things that you think are actually bad. And I think that Bob Hughes, bless him, from whom I learned an enormous amount, and I hope what's the right word? I portrayed affectionately in this book. I think Bob made a mistake. I think he would have recognized that it was a mistake. It was time to move on when the work no longer speaks to you in that way. There are a million wonderful subjects in the world to write about.
Well, and he did. He moved on to cities.
He wrote the great book about Australia.
Yes.
And particularly the city books,
yeah.
right? Barcelona, Rome, and so on. That was the right thing for Bob to do. That's where he belonged. That's where his imagination had come to rest.
Okay. I'm going to quote George Soros now in The Atlantic, February 1997. The cult of success can become a source of instability in an open society because it can undermine our sense of right and wrong. That is what is happening in our society today. Our sense of right and wrong is endangered by our preoccupation with success as measured by money. Anything goes as long as you can get away with it.
Well, and the question, respond to...
Well, respond to that, but I think what I'm getting at is that this is what the art of that period
I see what you mean. Well, here's the thing.
Suggesting.
That's a little thick. I have enormous respect for George Soros. My philosophical hero is Karl Popper, whom I share with Soros. I've never met him. And the Open Society, George Popper, exactly, is a great book, and I think Soros has done amazing work. And the reality that he's being victimized now is the kind of Jewish elder, the ultimate elder of Zion, is truly obscene.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's a little thick for George Soros to be saying that,
He's already made his money, right?
He's made his money, and he
yeah.
didn't make his money by doing good works in the streets of Calcutta.
Yeah.
He made his money by pursuing it. And I'm sure that if you knew the young George Soros, you'd have said he was as ambitious and indeed as avaricious as any human being on earth. So for George Soros to be lecturing other people about the evils of the pursuit of filthy lucre, I find a little tasteless.
Okay. But you're agreeing with the fact that that's what the zeitgeist of that period was like.
Well, yes and no. I mean, look, everybody's ambitious. I mean, as I said, George Soros is certainly ambitious. Adam Smith said that kind of ambition was the great engine of liberal societies. What I'd say is I don't think that the painters of that time were any more ambitious than the painters of any earlier time.
Yeah.
The world had changed in ways that made early success possible.
Well, they also incorporated that into their work.
And they incorporated it into their work, and that made it, and that was where some of its significance was found. One of the only moments of prescience in my entire life misspent as an art critic of that period was spotting very early on that Jeff Koons was going to be a very significant artist at a time when very few people, I think, saw that. And it was exactly because in that weird, semi-autistic, instinctive way that artists have, his peculiar kinds of ambitions got, what's the right word, phantomorized into the ambitions of the time. And I think that was significant.
You say of him, he's a mix of desperate sincerity with bizarre bad taste.
Yes. That was true. My favorite moment in the 1980s, and my favorite moment in the book, still one that makes me chuckle anyway, is when we were all at dinner at some point towards the end of that decade, and Jeff leaned over to Martha, my wife, and said, "Can you tell me something? What is irony?" And she sort of dumbfounded and turned and said, "Well, Jeff, I think you would know." And he said, "No, everyone is always saying my work is ironic. What is irony?"
It's ironic that he doesn't know what irony is.
Exactly, and that was the genius of Jeff Koons, was that he was making work that the whole world took as ironic, but he was making as sincerely and passionately as anyone else. That's what gave his work its vigor, as we might say.
You go on then to say about this zeitgeist, this sort of trying to capture it. This was false, of course. As long as morality exists, money will be mocked.
As long as mortality exists.
What did I say?
Morality.
Oh, you said mortality. I read it as morality.
Misprint.
What page did I? Oh no. Okay. Well, I'll take your word for it.
I think I actually know where it is, and maybe there may be an interesting misprint. I think it's right at the beginning here. Yeah. No, I did write mortality.
You did.
As long as mortality exists.
Well, you know what? Morality works better for me, but.
Well, for me, what I was trying to say is that we can't. The truth is that no one can actually create value, ultimate value, through money. We live as human beings on the mortal coil, and I think I go on to say that one of the moving things I remember is that Bob Hughes and Jeff Koons, who were as antipodal to each other as two human beings could be, in this relatively short period of time, I didn't bump into Bob called, but they both experienced the hugely painful loss of his son. Jeff through a kidnapping, not a death. Bob through his son's suicide, and their grief was more alike than their differences were different. And I think that's a lesson we cannot learn too often.
You say the world gets harder to capture, and there was a counter life taking place. What was that?
Well, that's very much the larger theme of this book, and the larger, if you like, the larger architecture of this book. It seemed to me that what was going on in that time, still goes on, though in a very different way, was that individual lives were becoming more and more intensely private in lots of ways. That all of the kind of, what should we call them, the intermediate institutions that had structured not just New York life, but life of liberal countries for a long time. Feelings of belonging to clubs and associations and to people coming together to argue in coffee houses or in taverns night after night had largely vanished and been replaced by this combination of very intense private existence and enormous...
Cocooning?
Yeah, a cocooning of a kind. Cocoons, if you like, on the one hand, and then this enormously bloated, unreal public existence that went on at the same time. So you sort of so the 80s were the time of the birth of these kind of monstrous helium balloon figures, of whom Donald Trump was probably the most noxious and shockingly turns out to be the most persistent. But it was also...
You put him on the cover of GQ, didn't you?
Not me personally, but the magazine did.
Okay.
Yeah, it was the first time he had ever been on a magazine cover.
Okay.
And so that kind of dialogue between this hugely... Koons himself was that kind of character. This grotesque, overblown, garish world, and then the private world of experience I encapsulate with the metaphor of the blue room and the big store, and that's how the book is organized.
Yes.
The blue room is the first half of the book, and the big store the second half.
Tiny little blue room. Your blue period.
Our blue period, absolutely.
During the 80s, we expected our ambitions to be realized. Today, this is you, today the youth have chastened ambitions. Adequacy seems, quote, bitterly enough. And now I'm going to quote my 24-year-old daughter, who just finished her master's degree, and she's on the job market, because I asked her about this, and she said, my generation is known for being quite optimistic about the future compared to Gen Xers and Boomers. The difference is that generally our ideas of success, are not just defined by what's in our wallets. We want work-life balance. We want experiences more than things. We want jobs that are engaging, and we want our work to have meaning. And then she attached a 68-page environics study to back that up.
It's a stirring credo. Look, I think that's probably true, but if you examine those words critically, there's a certain amount, forgive me for saying this, there's a certain amount of settling in that too. And I see it in my own 24-year-old. I don't think it's untrue. And the point I was making, and I'm convinced is so, is that the generation I came of age with, which was, I don't know what to call it, the kind of the meager tail end of the boomers, people coming of age in the 1980s, were still, for good or ill, and it's descriptive, not anything else, were ambitious in more conventional ways and imagined climbing a more conventional ladder of ambition than my son's or your daughter's generation, in my experience, are. It's not it's not better or worse. It just is different in the way it's conceived. Do
you think their chances of success, quote unquote,
well, your daughter puts it correctly. It's what's success, right?
Yeah.
In different set of values.
Yeah.
I see this in my own son, who is hugely ambitious in the sense that he can't go to enough classical music concerts or read enough philosophy, but is more indifferent than I might have been at that age to what's the next job, the next thing.
Yeah.
Let's put it very specifically. In our world, the world of writing, getting as I explained in the book, when we were kids in the 1980s, if you got a job that might sound ridiculous, the fiction editor of Playboy or the poetry editor of Mademoiselle, you were within the world of ambition. Those jobs no longer exist. Mm-hmm. And when my assistants go out on the job market, like your daughter, they usually end up with 5 or 6 different gigs that they have to put together. They do work for Kitchen.com and then for the Atlantic Online, and then they do lots of things. It's in many respects a richer existence, but it articulates its own ambitions in a different way.
Let's move on to art criticism more specifically.
Fascinates me that and intrigues me because we're talking so much about the art parts of the book, which pleases me enormously, but it's fascinating because in so many of the conversations, interviews, and responses to the book, people like that part the least. They sort of feel that I didn't
like it so much. I mean, I bridled at it, but
we're drawn to it. Maybe I'd like is the wrong word.
Well,
responded to at least. A lot of people felt that section of the book was kind of like, oh, I love the whole book, but that whole section on art was too.
Well, it's for me, it's contentious, and for us to have a good conversation, we need to argue.
No, I'm delighted to argue about it, just as so many people would much rather be talking about the.
Well, that's what part 2 and 3 of our conversation is about.
And mice and so on. But go on, please.
You mean like Metamorphosis, Kafka's Metamorphosis?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
A work of art that doesn't include two forces pulling in starkly opposed directions is never going to live. It's not original, but it's an astute observation about art.
Yeah, it's about my own education in looking. You know, if you're trained as an art historian. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
It's my son calling.
Ah.
What was it? Oh, if you're trained as an art historian, which I was, was in graduate school throughout much of the period this book covers, you're taught to understand pictures in terms of their place in a linear narrative. Various linear narratives get proposed, narrative of ongoing progress from the Renaissance on, narrative of ever greater flatness in Clement Greenberg's story, or then there are all the alternative counter-narratives that were just beginning to emerge. When I was a student, you judge a picture by what it doesn't contain as much as what it does and so on. And in all of those kinds of readings lead you to believe that the virtues of works of art, if they don't derive from a single thing, that the work of a critic is to define what that thing is that the work suggests. And as I got older and looked harder and had broader experience, I realized that every interesting work of art, or almost every one, was poised on contradictory impulses, just as I say in the book. And that's what makes them interesting. Take an example at random, Andy Warhol lives as an artist, I think, not because he was the first to see that pop icons could be the material for art, or because he dragged the Campbell soup can into the art gallery. Not a bit of it. It's interesting because he, on the one hand, had a complicated and very sophisticated sense of design, color, organization. He was an artist in that sense. And
because Duchamp did everything that he did
exactly.
Much earlier.
Exactly so. And at the same time, he had this mischievous, camp, in some ways deadpan, above all deadpan, appetite for bringing those icons in. Jasper Johns is an interesting painter, not because he was the first to introduce targets and flags and other things that were kind of non-design designs, but because if you look at that great white flag, on the one hand, it's as blunt a statement as anything that could be, and at the same time, it's as complexly nuanced a poem as any painting can be. And it's because he's got a little bit of Walt Whitman in him, and a little bit of Henry James in him, that we still vibrate to the great Johns from the 1950s. So I think that those kinds of contradictions are what we seek out in art and in writing too, and we do art a huge disservice when we reduce its significance to a message or a point or to its occupation of a particular moment in an historical narrative. When we turn works of art into pawns in a game of historical chess, we betray their nature.
And put in mind of Keats's negative capability.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. As I say, I'm hardly the first person to say this, but I think that Keats was right, completely right. He's talking about poetry rather than the visual arts. Yeah. But I think that's true.
I'll just quote you here. Being a good judge of art lies in having the ability to tell vital contradiction from vitiating confusion. Now, you say in the book that you're not a very good critic. You're a better storyteller. I don't think you said you're not cut out to be a real critic. I think that's what
right.
you said.
No, that's true.
So, two questions: why, and what does make a good critic that you don't seem to be able to? And why did the New Yorker hire you?
Well, I did the job for 8 years. I think I'm a very good critic in doing it. I don't think I have the critical vocation. They're two different callings. I don't think I have the critical calling. People have the critical calling. Bob Hughes is a good example. Pauline Kael. My friend Louis Menand, there's still one more, get enormous and almost complete sense of physical satisfaction from having put the work in its place, having contextualized it in the right way or judged it in a vigorous way. I respect the calling, but it isn't where my heart really beats. My heart beats in storytelling. My heart beats in a different kind of writing. And part
songwriting.
Yes. Yeah, songwriting, totally. so part of the history, the progress of this book is my own growing dissatisfaction with writing criticism for the reasons I try and present there.
Okay. Let's move on to part 2 of our conversation. We don't have any advertisements to break the tension.
You could write one.
A jingle. You could write a jingle.
Yeah, exactly.
Perhaps you could give us some very short, canned takes on, and this is what you do in the book, of some people who were mentors of yours. And I like the way you put this description of the book, fables from a time about a few people inside it.
That was my intention. I wasn't trying to write social history in the 1980s. I was trying to write not a memoir, but memoirs, so to speak.
We've touched on Bob Hughes. Can you give us a little bit more of your sense of the man?
Well, Bob was to preface this by saying, when I sat down to write this book, and it took me a very long time to write this book. I was supposed to write it in 2002, and it took me until 2017 to get it written. And it was partly because I didn't know how to handle the business of friendships with well-known people, because inevitably it can seem like name-dropping or...
Which is what you've been accused of.
Well, inaccurately. Because the truth is name-dropping has nothing to do with talking about people you know well. When we say that name...
it means you don't know them.
You don't know them well and you use their name...
You pretend like you know them.
You pretend that you know them. When you actually know somebody well, then it's not name-dropping.
No,
then it's memoir.
And people are interested in... I'm very interested in Bob Hughes.
Right, the second point I was going to make is that invariably, and in this regard, Boswell, the great James Boswell is my favorite example of it. Boswell was mocked mercilessly for writing all of that detailed stuff about Dr. Johnson and also about David Hume and Rousseau and so on, and it seemed terribly undignified to the highfalutin critics of his time. And of course, we're desperate for it now. There's nothing in the world we'd rather read because we love to feel that the fascinating people of another time are still alive.
And that's what he does, isn't it?
That's
With all the detail and the gossip and the conversation.
One of my favorite writers. And so the inevitable price you pay for the act of vitalizing interesting people is people saying, oh, it's too much detail and it's all that too. But that's just the way the world works, and there's nothing to be done about it.
Yeah.
Bob Hughes, in any case. So I preface that by saying, if I'm going to give capsule pictures of famous people, it has to be understood in that broader frame. Bob Hughes was a man of limitless appetite. As I've often said, he was out of time in lots of ways. He was a man of the 1890s, stuck in the 1980s. He had more poetry committed to memory than any other human being I've known. Huge chunks of Auden, all of Larkin, and I think I say in the book, you could save money on paperback copies of modern poets simply by pressing Bob's button. Australian poetry, Les Murray, and so on. And he had that kind of, and I want to put this carefully, a provincial reverence for culture. I mean by that coming out of Australia, the last thing he was satiated with Western art or with poetry. He was hungry for it because he didn't get it.
He was tired of Australia.
Exactly.
Yeah. He wrote a lovely memoir.
Yes, a beautiful book about it. Nothing If Not Critic. Oh, no, that was his collection. What was the memoir called? Things I Didn't Know. Yeah. Things I Didn't Know. And I shared that a little bit with him. We both came from corners of the empire. I'm Canadian and Bob is an Australian. And I think that was one of the things that made him hugely moving person to be with. He was also touchingly vulnerable despite all of his appearance of bluff and bluster. I remember when our son Luke was born, he brought him all of these Australian stuffed animals, which was an astonishing kind of hallucination in the middle of our living room. Bob bending over with all these stuffed animals. He constantly invited me to go fishing with him, and I always managed to evade it because it was truly, I don't know if you know what the expression Goya Shanahis is, but it's a Jewish term meaning things the Gentiles like, and fishing at 5 a.m. in a boat with a bottle of scotch, it was not my idea of a good time.
Now, this came up recently. I had dinner with some Australians, and I mentioned that, did they know him? They had heard of him, but the only context in which they'd heard of him was that he had done something wrong in a legal case.
Yes.
Can you clarify that?
Yeah, what had happened is it's a truly tragic thing. Bob, who was a patriotic Australian, is at some remove from a very distinguished family in Australia, Catholic family, when he had that horrific motor accident, which is one of those things where, it's a horrible thing to say, but it seemed like God intended to kill him and then forgot, and Bob was in pain the rest of his life every day. said what was interpreted. He said somebody gave curry to someone else, and Bob said, and it was an old Australian expression, but it was interpreted as a racist put down of the prosecuting attorney. Anyway, it was one of those horrific things where Bob, who was clearly the victim of this thing, was put on trial for having caused this accident, which also hurt other people. And it was a hugely wounding thing to Bob, and seemed to me, without being familiar with the details of the case, wildly unfair, and hardly could have suffered more than Bob did.
Richard Avedon.
Well, Dick is central to this book. He's very much the Gandalf of the book. Dick Avedon was a kind of adoptive father for Martha and me as a couple. And, I write about him because I think that one of the great events in anybody's life, if you're lucky enough to have it, is when you have a charismatic mentor who takes you on. Mm-hmm. My friend Meg Wolitzer, who also appears in the book, has just written a novel called The Female Persuasion, which is just about that on what used to be called the distaff side, about a young woman who's adopted, so to speak, by a kind of Gloria Steinem, Nora Ephron figure, and how it changes her life. But Dick was a man of truly incandescent ebullience. He woke up every day with an appetite for existence that was unshakable. The last time we were together, to tell you a story, about 2 days before he died, actually, it was at 3 a.m. in the Mission in San Francisco, to which we had gone together because one of my many nephews was doing a rap act. And he was under the rap name of Lex Luthor. His real name is Alexei Gopnik, obviously. And he was doing this, and Dick, 81 years old, and I said to him, I don't think this is going to be particularly good, had such an insatiable appetite for new experience that there was part of him, could be interesting, could be the next thing, and he had spent his life, not in a kind of fashionable way searching for the next thing, but looking for the next great significance, where it would come from. And that's why there's an Avedon of the 1940s, an Avedon of the 1950s, an Avedon of the 1960s, 70s, and so on. He had a greater responsiveness to experience of that kind than anyone I've ever known. And he suffered from it too, because people put him down as a journalist. Irving Penn, who was his great rival and friend of a kind, once said, Avedon is the ultimate seismograph. And Dick hated that. It sounds like a great compliment. Mm-hmm. Dick found it enormously insulting. So he was all of that too. But he was also a man of immense personal generosity and kindness. He was one of those, the 4 people you meet in a lifetime who, when the door opens and it's Dick, it's, I think Ken Tynan said once that about Orson Welles. You were never unhappy to have Orson come into the room, and you were never unhappy to have Dick come into the room.
You make the point that existential portraits were really fashion portraits, and you had some kind of is it a
we argued about it all the time. Oh, sure.
What, can you? I didn't really get that.
Sure. Though he loved his early fashion work, which he had included in the book from the show at the Met, he increasingly invested himself as an artist in those very spare Giacometti-like portraits of people isolated against white backgrounds, looking desperately unhappy with the stigmata of anxiety marked on their forehead, and so on. And I always wanted him to see that the two things were in dialogue, that they were parts of one sensibility. They were not exactly as we were talking about before. Mm-hmm. That was exactly the fertile contradiction in his work. He was a man who had an enormous gift for female beauty and for graphic extravagance, who also was drawn to and understood the infinite sadness of mortality. And that it was exactly when he got those two things in dialogue that his work came most to life. This is the greatest picture maybe he ever made, was of Oscar Levant. Don't know if you've seen that one, where Levant, who was a great man of style and wit, looks looks totally crazy and bizarre, but you see both the wit and the madness at the same time. That's the part of Dick's work that I value most and wanted him to value most as well.
Kirk Varnado.
Well, I don't really write much about Kirk in this book, and that was deliberate. I had written a long essay in a previous book, Through the Children's Gate, called Last of the Metrozoids, about him. And you'll forgive my putting it this way, but I am, or try to be, an artist rather than a chronicler, and I felt that I'd gotten Kirk down right once. And I wasn't, even though, in fact, from a narrative point of view, his absence is felt in this book, because he was very much my closest friend and the person with whom I walked through the art world most intensely, more than with Bob Hughes, certainly. But I felt that I'd gotten Kirk as right as I could get him in that essay, and I didn't want to get him wrong in another context.
Okay, finally, part 3 of our conversation, the memoir part, the love, the marriage, and Martha, the beautiful and strange Martha, the champion sleeper Martha. At 18, she was the prettiest girl I had ever seen, and that she should have found me appealing remains the great event and mystery of my life.
True.
You know, this reminds me, because you talk about how you want to bring home the bacon for her. You want to prove yourself to her. That's what's been driving much of what you're behind what's your ambitions.
Yes.
And I'm reminded of Mordecai Richler's attitude to his second wife.
I think that's absolutely apt and true.
Florence.
I knew Mordecai reasonably well and had dinner with Florence not a month or so ago. Oh no, I think it was longer than that. It was in the fall in Toronto. And if that were the case, I'd be very proud. Mordecai was a man of immense mordant humor and who tended to had no illusions about the world, but he deeply loved his wife. And I thought that was a deeply gallant and admirable trait in him. And I think that's probably so.
Yeah, the book is really a love letter to your wife. You talk about her being stylish, an unerring eye for what looked right, and the two of you. Sorry.
No, I was going to say it's very powerful for me, very poignant for me to be walking up and down Sherbrooke Street. I dragged my bag from the hotel here earlier because this was the theater. Sherbrooke Street in those days was the fashionable shopping street. This is almost 40 years ago, in Montreal, to a degree that it isn't any longer. And we would just, she was an 18-year-old girl, and we would look in the windows of things, and she just had unerring taste for what was beautiful, even though she had no background in it. It just was her natural flair, and she was ridiculously well-dressed, not fashionably dressed, just distinctly dressed, still for an 18-year-old girl. And she just was one of those, she just did a natural feeling. I tease the kids now. I say, all your mother really cares about is how you look in your clothes. She wants you to be happy and fulfilled, but she really just cares about how you look in your clothes. And there was a lot of that in her. I also realized now, I was walking up and down, and I realized the degree to which and I don't think I dramatized it sufficiently in the book, I played the Mr. Sensitivo button. I was for another thing, I did an interview about my favorite movies with someone, and I realized there were all these movies I'd taken Martha to see, like Nantes and early Truffaut and Fellini, and I realized I was working the rep cinema button extremely hard for the most obvious of reasons. And Martha, I think, sometimes wonder where Mr. Sensitivo went to, and
well, you got what you wanted, right?
And you got what you wanted. And like Joseph Conrad wrote, Mr. Sensitivo, he did, and now I just I'm one more grabber.
You believed in, quote, poetry, an attitude toward life. What's that?
Well, as I say in the book, I think it's everything but rhymed and metered verse when we met. We wanted an elevated view of life. We meant that we thought that there was I don't know what to call it, an aesthetic dimension, a brighter horizon, a wilder shore. And I end the book, and it's very much the journey, if I can use that hackneyed word, of the book, is that that the poetry of your imagination gets replaced by the prose of existence, which is another kind of poetry, more enduring kind of poetry. That's what happens to this couple in the course of their experience. Their poetry turns into prose, as it does for all of us, and the prose becomes another kind of poetry. That's what happens in the book.
And then you have sex, of course, a lot of sex early on, but you talk about long married sex being, quote, furious action and complete predictability. And I had to question, still furious action?
Well, it's my favorite passage in the book, because it's my favorite metaphor in the book, in a book probably overdense with metaphors, is that sex and long-term marriage gets to be like a Civil War reenactment. And I mean furious action in that sense, right? It's the simulation of what had once been furious action by all these guys that go away for the weekend to refight the Battle of Gettysburg or the Battle of Spotsylvania or something. And like then we engage in furious action even though the outcome is completely known in advance.
Right.
So I will add to that, though that's my favorite metaphor in the book, and I do it in this show that I did last night here at the Shar, and Martha objected to it when I wrote it, and she doesn't like it when I do it, and she finds the whole thing embarrassing, but I find it irresistible.
Well, you also say, I think, that, what is it about critics? The audacity of putting in something about the fact that the stuff that lasts, because you put married sex in here, you insert audacity in a book. That's always the part that critics hate. The part that the critics hate lasts. That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh yeah, I probably said that in an interview somewhere, and I think that tends to be always true. So that the parts, the least decorous parts of what you do, tend to be the parts that are the most original, and therefore tend to be. I'm not an unduly audacious writer. I'm hardly William Burroughs, but nor would I want to be. But I do think that I was pleased to insert something mildly audacious about married sex, because it was a subject that seemed to me to have been written about too discreetly.
On page 101, you say, I would never be so happy again. I found that quite sad. I think that was...
What was I saying that about?
I think you were talking about something with GQ.
Oh,
and come up with the chic...
Right, the chair skirt thing.
Yeah.
Well, I think that was, storyteller's hyperbole. I've been happier since when my kids were born, and of course, the truest happiness of life tends to emerge in, at 9 o'clock in the morning when you've had your coffee and the sun shining, and there's, you have writing seems plausible for a bit. But it was certainly true that as a writer, I was never any more happy than I was seeing that giant reproduction of those two dumb words.
Yeah. You say that the standard quarrel of every happy marriage is about food. What about sex and money?
Well, I think that I said of every happy marriage is about food, right?
Yeah.
In unhappy marriages, it seems to me you quarrel all the time about sex and money.
Okay.
In happy marriages where sex and money have found their own level, or at least a decent
But actually,
enough
unhappy marriages, you argue about everything.
Yeah, yes. Well,
that's Tolstoy would have said.
Yes, as I say in the book, I think someplace, in an unhappy marriage, you argue every day, but it's always about a different thing. It's a new thing. In a happy marriage, you argue every day, but it's always about the same thing. Martha and I have kind of come to our piece. I did a lecture last night, and they handed me the check, as lecture people will do. Mm-hmm. And I was just on the phone with her, and she said, "So how much was it for?" And I said, "Oh, I haven't opened it yet." She said, "You haven't opened it yet?" And that was long ago. We realized that she would keep the books, and I would bring home a chunk of the bacon. Mm-hmm. And we still have that. So we solved the money problem many years ago.
I'd just like to hit you with a few of your beautiful phrases and advice. I loved what your father told you when you left Montreal. Never underestimate the other person's insecurity. What a great piece of advice.
Isn't that a fantastic piece of advice?
Yeah.
It transpired not 5 blocks from here. Right at the old bus station, which is 5 blocks from here. My dad still is, a man of immense instinctive wisdom, and he was a dean for much of his professional life of students, so he had a lot of and he had 6 kids, so he had a lot of paternal wisdom. And of all the many wise things he said to me, the 2 that I've shaped my life by: never underestimate the other person's insecurities. And whenever I've put a foot significantly wrong, it was because I did. And the other thing he told me, which isn't in the book, is in a conflict, never think about what's fair, think about what you want. More people go wrong because they feel in professional conflict or in a legal thing, they think about, that's not fair, it's not just, I'm going to get it.
Or in a marriage, it's like you're being selfish.
Exactly. Don't think about what's fair. Think about what you really want. And what you really want is the thing to go after, because life is not going to be fair.
And you're not being selfish by doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just think about what the goal is here, don't think about what's just. And I think that was hugely wise. And it was certainly wise in New York.
A line about intellectuals. I love this. Intellectuals believe that making up new names for things is the same as having new thoughts.
Oh, you're the first person to catch it. I like that thought too. I think it's real, and I was trying to. It was part of a little riff I had about shop talk, about the pleasures of shop talk. And it's true that in the academic world, which I was beginning to rebel against, and I come from an academic family, in this thing, that I was aware of that intellectuals do think that you make up a new word and you've had a new thought. In the fashionable world, which I was beginning to enter, at least the difference is you make up a new word and at least you have a new fashion. But it's more, it has a wittier self-consciousness about it.
A sense of trust in the universe is the greatest gift we can give our kids.
Yeah, I often think about my father in that way, because the universe is not a benevolent place. We all could be run over by a car, or trapped by a serial killer, or by disease tonight. But my father chose to see the universe as an essentially salubrious place, at least for his kids. And he always gave us that sense that things would work out, things were going to be okay, no matter what however...
Kind of a confidence.
Yes.
Or also a security.
Right. Not a confidence of saying, like, go out and fight for it, you'll bring home every prize. Not at all. Just, it's going to be okay. You're worrying unduly. And I've always noticed that men who have loving fathers tend to have confidence in the world. I think I mentioned in the book that I knew a wonderful critic, Wilfred Shee.
Catholic. Right?
Catholic.
Yeah.
Devoutly Catholic man.
Didn't he have a publishing house?
Yes, his father did.
Yeah.
Sheed and Ward, great Catholic publishing house. Anyway, his father, he had a very loving relationship with a hugely benevolent father. And Bill Sheed went through more plagues and suffering than Job. He had polio, and then he had a drinking problem, and then he got cancer of the tongue. And he was never really diminished by it. His buoyancy was never diminished by his setbacks. And I realized it was because he still had his father in the front seat, and he thought it was going to be okay. It was going to work out. I think that is the greatest gift you can give your kids, a sense that the universe... Now, of course, there's an illusion built into it, because the universe is not a benevolent place, in fact. But I think it is...
Well, it's neutral, let's say.
Yes, it's neutral. So you want them to feel that it can be benevolent. And the people who I think are bad parents tend to frighten their kids about. And frighten your kids is the worst thing you can do.
Just winding down here. The secret
I'm enjoying this.
Great, good. The secret of writing is to go places and listen to people, and to write with wild exactitude.
Yeah.
You suggest that would be a good name
for a book. Yeah, if I ever wrote, which I don't think I ever will, wrote a book about writing, that's what I call it. It's a line of Joe Mitchell's, a phrase of Joe Mitchell's, which he had not, which was totally spontaneous in his part. I was asking him about, the great New Yorker writers of his generation, Thurber and Mitchell, and Thurber and Liebling, and so on. And he said, none of them could spell, and no idea grammar, but each one had a wild exactitude of his own. And I knew instantly what he meant by that. He meant that coming back to our subject, that the fertile contradiction of being as precise as you possibly could be about the surface of the world, and at the same time having some obviously extravagant, almost surrealist passion beneath it. It's what we love in Mitchell, it's what we love in Gogol, it's what we love in Thurber, it's what we love in almost every writer, but particularly in those kinds of more miniaturist, fable-making writers. And it's always been my motto, a wild exactitude. And the other thing about, go places and see people was, again, part of my own emancipation as a writer from being a graduate student. Chekhov says someplace that he spent his life thrashing the serf out of himself, meaning the habits of obsequiousness that a serf has. And I've spent my life thrashing the graduate student out of myself, and the habits of contentiousness and thesis building. I obviously have not been successful at it completely or even largely, but I did learn in my early years at the New Yorker, when I would just write anonymous reporting 2 or 3 times a week, thousands or hundreds anyway of pieces, that there's nothing more powerful than listening. There's nothing more powerful than going to the one odd person and getting the one reverberant quote.
Yeah.
And that we overburden ourselves with writing when so much good writing is just accurate listening.
Well, so much good interviewing is about listening. That's what
Exactly. You do it. You have to guide it. So you just go down the middle of the questions rather than engage in with the thing. I think that's true. It's one of the things I learned and it's been a pleasure. Just to add, I was just back out for the first time doing a long profile for the first time in years, just because the shape my life is, not years, but a couple of years. The shape my life has taken, and I just love doing it. Just being in rooms with good talkers makes writing very easy.
Well, you're making my interview very easy.
Well, that's good. Then I'm paying it back, as the kids say, to the people I listen to.
Tumor is the size of a grapefruit, a rat always the size of a cat.
Yes, haven't you ever noticed that tumors always compared to fruit, and rats are always compared to other animals, cats, or even cars or something, inevitably.
Yeah. I liked what you say about memoir and about making private life public. It's treacherous, but be not afraid, because if you don't, we're all locked in terror.
Yeah, of all the things that writing does, persuade us to vote for the right person rather than the wrong one, to bring in gun control, organizes our social existence. Of all the things that writing does, for me the most essential is that it makes private life public. But that don't mean it spills secrets, but that it takes the inner life that we all have and makes it part of the common conversation. And it's
but what about this confession culture?
Well, I don't mind the confession culture. What I mind is the atrocity culture. The book about how the victim culture, I think, is a different thing than confession culture. Because if you think about it, we don't like what you call confession culture, and I often don't like it either, because it seems to us witless and unaware. When we read, who can we indict here? James Fry, or one of those people, it seems too melodramatic, hysterical. But when we read Joan Didion about her loss of her husband, or when we read...
it's a very affecting movie.
Hugely affecting movie. Or when we read in a fictional mode, which we know to be real in every way. We read Philip Roth on aging, let's say. We're overcome by it. We read Philip Roth on masturbation. Our first thing is, oh my God, and our second thought is, him too? And that's
seeing
the
yourself.
response. Yes,
Yeah.
and that's what writers do, and that's our function. And inevitably, if you're struggling to make private life public, as we were talking about before about married sex, people are squeamish about private life being made public, not because it's egotistical, but because it's disturbing, because your private life is as squalid, and your inner life is as squalid as the next person's. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that writing makes us aware of. The music of all of our minds is monstrous, and that as Goya understood. And that's our, to be a little pompous about it, that's our humanity. That's what we. I was just rereading Mordecai Richler's great novel. Solomon Gursky was here.
Some suggest that's the greatest Canadian novel.
I would totally subscribe to that idea. I think Alice Munro might be the greatest Canadian writer, but I think that Solomon Gursky is the greatest Canadian novel. And it's all about it's all what, it's a shanda to the Jews, Solomon Gursky. It's all the stuff you're not supposed to say. It's impious. It's wildly impious and obscene, and accurate and truthful and persuasive.
Finally, you say that you never get over how fortunate you've been, and I'd like to say I've been very fortunate in having been able to interview you. Thank you very much.
It was a delight to talk to you.
I've been speaking with Adam Gopnik, his latest book, memoir, work of criticism. Anything else?
It's a self-confessional tale, warning example, do not as I did children book.
It's called At the Stranger's Gate. It's published by Knopf, both in Canada and
Knopf
US.
Canada and Knopf US, but separately by the two, because I like to keep my Canadian identity alive.
Thanks again.
Pleasure talking to you.